he kept his most treasured things. Not that they amounted to much, but they were all he had. He'd had little time to gather his belongings from his aunt and uncle's house after he'd been caught stealing bread from the market in plain sight, almost a year ago now. As he'd fled, the owner of the stall warned she'd call the authorities, and though he didn't know if she had, just the threat of having to pay a fine or worse had been enough incentive to leave his village. And also, regardless of whether the authorities would be on his trail, rumors were bound to reach his aunt and uncle, bringing shame, and they had enough to deal with. Not that they would miss him all that much, with so many other mouths to feed. Still, since then, he'd learned not to make that same mistake again, no matter how hungry he became in his travels. So this arrangement worked well most nights. He'd always worked for himself, never wanting to be kept by anyone, or to give most of his earnings to some scoundrel who might treat him worse than the customers. So he avoided the notorious corners where other whores lured willing men. He respected those rent boys, even though they didn't always return the favor. But he understood their frustration and desperation. There was limited space, patrons as well. Like them, he did what he needed to survive. Speaking of which, Galen waited for the man with the acrid breath to be on his way instead of fussing with the buttons on his placket. He'd no doubt need some sobering up. Galen was hoping for a moment to himself before he limped off to take care of his empty stomach. He'd worry about his tender hole later. But when Galen next glanced at the customer, the man's eyes were flat, dark stones, matching the aura surrounding him. Again, he asked himself what in the hell he'd been thinking, but his growling stomach reminded him that desperation had clouded his judgment. Besides, the wind whistling through the alleyway signaled a late-season snow was due to fall in Lunar's reach, which meant fewer potential customers, especially those with inclinations he could fulfill. He'd no doubt be sleeping in a doorway this evening, or perhaps he could make it all the way to the covered bridge despite the soreness and stickiness he was now feeling. The sting as he shifted told him just how unlikely that was. He'd fared much worse, but he still hoped not to pass one more night without food. When the man was finally able to straighten his clothing, the gray outlining his features grew darker, and Galen's pulse jumped. He recognized the very moment the man came to his senses. Sometimes the sobering reminder of what they'd done caused them to scurry off, shame hanging from their sated bodies. Others, like this one, would have more to say, and Galen decided not to wait around for it. "You fucking molly whore," the man said through clenched teeth just as Galen took a step forward. "Making me lose control." He'd heard the same sentiment too many times to count. Such a shame. The guilt and frustration weighed them down like a wet coat. Proper society dictated that men like them were a disgrace, and not only should they lose all standing, but be punished as well. Galen ignored such faulty logic. He took pride in using his body for work. After all, the food was for his own survival. And unlike this man, he would never allow himself to fall into the blackness of self-loathing. Turning toward the darkened street, he should have left quietly, but something hot and angry poked at that hollow space in his gut. "You chose to follow me and pay for use of my body? Maybe you're the—" The man gripped his shoulder roughly, and before Galen could react or even make sense of what was happening, the man's arm swung and his fist made such solid contact with Galen's mouth he saw stars. His body crumpled to the ground like an accordion as the metal taste of blood filled his mouth. But the man wasn't done, swearing and spitting and kicking Galen repeatedly in the stomach, making him gasp for breath. Tears sprang to his eyes as he turned his head and vomited violently into the dirt. He vaguely recalled the man bending down to retrieve the coin Galen dropped, then heard his retreating footsteps. But he couldn't move, couldn't even lift a hand to help dry his tears. He felt the first snowflake melt against his cheek before his world went dark. He didn't know how many minutes or hours he lay barely conscious.